Hey everyone, it's Mike, and welcome to Chip Damage. And today I'm going to be trying to answer a very difficult question. What do I think is the greatest gaming generation of all time? Now, this came to me as I was recently digging through the collection and kind of just generally wondering. The question kind of came to me like, what generation of consoles do I generally go to when I'm looking for quality? Or rather, when I'm looking and thinking of my favorite games, where do they generally fall? What era of gaming do they generally fall? Now, as you all know, I'm not particularly a retro gamer or modern gamer. I love all games. I don't think gaming necessarily peaked at any point and is getting worse or is always getting better, always getting worse. It's kind of just moving with time and fluctuating. Some things get better, some things get worse, some things go away, some things come back. It's all great. There's greatness in every generation of consoles that you can look into. And of course, I should mention, I am going to have to kind of sequester PC in this. PC, of course, very nebulous in its generations. It's not like consoles, it's kind of modular. However, PC games are indicative of the trends of console games at the time and vice versa. They kind of evolve sometimes totally parallel, but sometimes very similarly with their console counterparts. So that is something to keep in mind during this. But we will be mostly focusing, I guess, on consoles at the moment. But yeah, what is the greatest? How do you measure such a thing? I mean, I guess you could look at the most obvious metric of sales numbers, right? Like what sold the most, what made the most money. However, much like with film, I don't think that tells the whole story. The highest grossing films are not necessarily, almost certainly not the best films of all time. They just have a certain market appeal, mass appeal that kind of pulls in mass audiences. So I don't think that's a very good metric. You could look at the impact that a console generation left on the industry, whether it brought something new to the table like online play or VR, 3D graphics, a new controller style, what have you, and what legacy that left behind. However, for myself, for this discussion, I kind of wanted to look at something kind of basic, something obvious. What I believe are the best games, which is again, of course, completely subjective. I mean, that is entirely opinion based. However, I think there are general consensuses out there for what measures what is and is not a bad, good, or great game. And after thinking about that and where kind of that falls into, and what legacies this particular console generation left on the industry and is still leaving on the industry, I kind of came to a consensus, and that's what I want to talk about today with you, my audience. And I want to know, what do you think is the best console generation of all time? What is your favorite? What do you think is objectively the best? Because this is just something fun to talk about. It doesn't really matter. I mean, the idea of console generations is starting to kind of go in itself. Like, the Switch itself, one of the most popular consoles of all time, kind of finds itself halfway through a generation. If you were to look it up on, let's say, Wikipedia, we are currently in the 9th generation of consoles with the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series systems. But the Switch launched well after the 8th generation consoles with like PS4, Xbox One, and Wii U, but well before the more modern consoles. And I guess it's listed as 8th gen, but it kind of competes with the 9th gen. This has happened before in the past. But for the majority, for the last 30 years or so, there pretty much have been like the big boys, the big console makers, releasing consoles within a relatively similar span of time to compete with one another. And this is just kind of a fun thing I want to talk about. And I think it's something that, kind of stirs conversation about what constitutes good games and what trends and practices I would like to see return and some that I would like to see leave. So yes, without further ado, let's jump into the topic itself. If you're interested in such a topic and things like this, please like and subscribe and check out my other videos. So yeah, let's, before I reveal my answer, I just want to say that, in terms of importance, you can't really overstate the early systems impact. I mean, I believe the first, what we would consider video game console is listed as the Magnavox Odyssey, like in 1972. But from my understanding of that, that was more of like a novelty, like almost a toy. What most modern people would recognize as the basis of a video game console would be something more along the lines of the Atari 2600 and ColecoVision, kind of popularizing and breaking more into the mainstream of gamers. And the importance of those cannot be overstated. I mean, they're the first, like some of the first right there. But I really think that the most important video game console of all time is the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Famicom, which really solidified the quality and what people could expect and kind of set the template for really gaming up until the modern day, all the way up until now as we enter 2024. However, I don't necessarily think that is the greatest video game console generation of all time. But I do have massive respect for that generation, the 8-bit generation or third generation. I mean, the NES and the Master System, to a lesser extent, wonderful generation. Still very playable with games like, of course, Super Mario Brothers and Mega Man and Castlevania. Early, physics-based gaming, 2D graphics. However, I think the next generation after that, which was mostly headed up by the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and lesser extent like the Neo Geo. I think that kind of perfected or refined 2D gaming to a much higher extent. Fantastic games like Mario World and Sonic the Hedgehog, and Neo Geo coming out with King of Fighters, and that console lasting all the way up to 2004. Really beautiful sprites, kind of pushing the boundaries with some early 3D with games like Star Fox or Virtual Racing. And then, of course, we had the generation after that, with its biggest impact being the breakout of the third dimension, 3D graphics, true 3D graphics with pretty damn great games. Your PlayStation 1, your Nintendo 64, and your Sega Saturn mostly, allowing for better storytelling in games with games like Final Fantasy VII, Ocarina of Time, Metal Gear Solid, Silent Hill, horror really like becoming a genre all its own and being able to scare you with games like Resident Evil and what have you. Fantastic, groundbreaking titles like Super Mario 64. However, 3D was rudimentary. It was still experimental. Controllers for such things were rudimentary. If you remember, the early PlayStation 1 controllers did not have joysticks on them. The N64 controller was cumbersome. The Sega Saturn, its basic controller didn't have a 3D stick for the longest of times, and it really didn't master 3D quite well. So that brings me, after that long preamble, to what I think is the greatest generation of all time, and what I would like to talk about and defend today and hear your thoughts about as well. And that is the 6th generation of video game consoles. Or to put it bluntly, the generation that includes the Sega Dreamcast, releasing in 1998 in Japan, 1999 here. The PlayStation 2 releasing in 2000 in Japan, and later in the year in October in the US. The Nintendo GameCube launching in November 18th, 2001 in America, and the Microsoft Xbox in November 15th, 2001. I'm going to use the copy of Soul Calibur 1 and the ports of Soul Calibur 2 to kind of represent them. For those who know, if you know why I'm using these to kind of represent these consoles. Yes, I think, and I'll go over why I don't think the preceding generations were necessarily better, though great at the end of the video, the generations that followed this. I really think that this generation was really a wonderful era that I think a lot of developers and gamers are still kind of yearning for those days and chasing certain trends and hoping certain things would return to. And why? Why is that? Well, let's say I believe that in this era, the second generation of 3D gaming, much like how 16-bit gaming refined 8-bit 2D graphics, like gaming, I think this generation kind of perfected or started to perfect and refine 3D gaming in a lot of ways. Developers were more confident in what they could do, and there was a huge leap in power over the prior generation to allow more expansive worlds. So let's go through it, shall we? We'll go through in chronological order of why I think each one of these systems is individually great, and why as a whole at the very end, I think is still the greatest gaming generation of all time. So let's go back. Let's go back to mid to late 1999. I'm a young boy at the time, and I'd been gaming for a while. This is not purely nostalgic. I started gaming well before this. I had, the Genesis, Super Nintendo, then PlayStation, Saturn. So I've been gaming for quite a while. This is not the first generation that I encountered as a kid, but 1999, been gaming for a while. I walk into what I believe is a Kmart at the time, if memory serves, and I see a demo kiosk with a console on it that I'd never really seen before. And I go up to it, and I hear music. I hear like this bouncy beach theme, and I look on this demo reel that's playing on something called the Sega Dreamcast, and I see Sonic the Hedgehog running down the pier from an orca that's chasing him, destroying the pier, and I was blown away. Now, for younger gamers out there, for my younger viewers, it's really hard to kind of communicate how much bigger a jump in visuals console generations used to be. Now, today, the jump from like PS4 to PS5 and even from PS3 to PS4, while noticeable, obviously, it's not this massive leap that would kind of blow you away. They're more kind of minute details that you're looking for, kind of like high resolution, high polygon count, what have you. But the jump back then was massive. Obviously, from 2D to 3D was something else. But the jump from the next most powerful consoles, like the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation, the Nintendo Dreamcast, was absolutely absurd. This was Sega's last chance to kind of capture the console market, kind of recover from the failures of the Sega 32X and the Sega Saturn, and kind of catch up. And they were going to go all out. So they doubled the power of the most recent system, the N64, with the Dreamcast 128 bit with a 128-bit system, and it was unbelievable. I remember I saw that whale chasing Sonic, like a tear came from my eye. I saw Ready to Rumble boxing, and for a moment I'm like, oh yeah, those are real people. That's as good as graphics can get, and I needed to have that console. And I did get that console, later that Christmas. I was very lucky. And what the Dreamcast really had, and to this day, it has a very unique library that kind of gives the game console a personality unlike anything else. So, of course, you had breakout hits, early titles like Sonic Adventure and Soul Calibur. A great first 3D outing, true 3D outing for Sonic. I don't care what anyone says, this game is still fantastic to this day. Great soundtrack, big story, multiple playable characters. Soul Calibur actually having a port that was more beautiful than the arcade counterpart. It was actually surpassing its arcade counterpart. With that being said, you had great titles a little later on. The Dreamcast was only alive for about a year and a half, up to 18 months in the US, from like $99.99 until like August 2001, I believe they produced games for it. But there were great hits like Sonic Adventure, obviously Sonic Adventure 2, many people's favorite 3D Sonic to this day. You had unique games throughout its lifespan that were just wonderful. A lot of them arcadey in nature, like the Crazy Taxi games, Crazy Taxi 1 and 2, Crazy Taxi 2 being exclusive, except for like the PSP to this very day. Fun, quick, arcadey action that looked fantastic. Unique, beautiful titles like Jet Grind Radio, or Jet Set Radio as it's known in the rest of the world. Still to this day, games like Bomb Rush, Cyberpunk, are still taking influence from this game, and it got its home on the Dreamcast originally as a cult hit. You had arcade titles coming home for the first time, equaling or surpassing the beauty and the fidelity of their arcade counterparts. Amazing fighting games from Capcom, like Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and 2. Marvel vs. Capcom 2, this is still like the preferred version that most people play, the Dreamcast port. One of the greatest, not only fighting games of all time, but just one of the greatest games of all time. That was only on Dreamcast. This was not capable to be played on generations before. The port of Marvel 1 on Dreamcast is fantastic too. The port on PlayStation 1 barely runs. And again, more arcadey, fun action using the 4 controller ports, things you wouldn't get elsewhere, like Power Stone 1 and 2. You had more niche titles coming over from the arcade that you'd only get on Dreamcast, like Garou, Mark of the Wolves, a game that a sequel is coming to this day because this game is so highly lauded, and for a while it was exclusive only to the Dreamcast. You had enhanced ports of games from the prior generation that looked and played even better on the Dreamcast. You had like games like Star Wars Episode 1 Racing, one of my favorite racing games of all time. It was on the prior generation of consoles, but it looked and played so much better on the Dreamcast. And of course, you just had like unique and weird titles like Seaman and Typing of the Dead, just weird offshoots, like just shots in the dark that you don't see a lot, that required hardware. Typing of the Dead requiring a keyboard, and Seaman requiring a microphone and like a special memory card to play. And like to this day, the Dreamcast is such a beloved console. It might be my favorite console of all time. Not only did it look great, but it just had weird, fun, quick to play titles. Of course, you had fantastic larger games like Shenmue and Skies of Arcadia. and despite its short lifespan, it's still a highly vaunted system today. Like I said, games like Bomb Rush Cyberpunk still taking influence from Dreamcast games. Remasters of House of the Dead and Panzer Dragoon, which had their homes on, well, Panzer Dragoon on the Saturn, but just like these Sega era titles coming back to this very day. And unfortunately, despite all that, the Dreamcast did not sell very well worldwide. And like I said, it kind of was a precursor to the sixth generation, almost like how the Switch is kind of between generations, with the Dreamcast launching quite a while before the next game console proper in this generation. Which brings me to that next console. And boy, though this next console isn't necessarily my favorite, if you were to go by sheer metrics, it would be the greatest system of all time. And that is what I'll use here to represent Soul Calibur 2, the PlayStation 2. What can I say about the PlayStation 2? Somewhere between 155 and 158 million consoles sold. To this day, right now in 2023, late 2023, nothing has surpassed that sales number. The Nintendo DS came close with 154, and the Switch is chasing it, with like 130 some odd million units. But you must understand, like, gaming has grown. For something 20 years ago to have sold this many units is unfathomable. Yes, the thing came with a DVD player built in, which of course increases popularity, but games were being made for the PlayStation 2 for many years. I believe like the console had active games being made for it for 14 years, from like 2000 to 2014, which is absurd. And it's easy to see why. That console was a huge leap over PlayStation 1. Unbelievable. If you compare PlayStation 1 to 2 titles, you wouldn't know that there was only 6 years between them. You'd think it would be like 20. The PlayStation 2 also had quite a good graphical leap over the most prior system, the Dreamcast. And though it didn't have quite the uniqueness right out of the gate of the Dreamcast, its library kind of is undeniable, and its sheer scope and breadth and magnitude of titles. It's kind of hard to debate on a sheer quantity side that this may be the greatest console of all time. I can make a whole nother video dedicated to that. But you had early titles like Ico, and it's a terrible North American box art, being like an early example of an art house game, almost like an indie game. What would be known as more common later, a wonderful title that is still highly vaunted. It was very influential to games like Dark Souls later on, and any puzzle platformer. Beautiful game. You had the solidification and maybe a high point for the survival horror genre with games like Silent Hill 2, 3, 4. Kind of the lion's share of the Silent Hill series was here, the best parts of it. To this day, Silent Hill, people are still screaming for it to come back. And only a year ago was it announced that a number of Silent Hill titles were going to be released after a long hiatus. Silent Hill 2 in particular being remade, still being considered one of the scariest and most personal games ever made. In 2001, unbelievable. Silent Hill 3 still being a classic, and even though they kind of tapered off after that, Silent Hill 4 and ports of Silent Hill Shattered Memories of Origins released on the PS2. High points for that genre. You had some of the greatest games of all time pushing both gameplay and cinematic quality with the Metal Gear Solid sequels. Metal Gear Solid 1 being fantastic, but Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 being immense leaps. Postmodernism in Metal Gear Solid 2. The beauty of Metal Gear Solid 2 in 2001 cannot be understated, how technically advanced that game is. If you play that game today, it still looks good. Metal Gear Solid 3 having one of the greatest stories in gaming of all time, considered one of the greatest games of all time. All of the Metal Gears are considered some of the greatest games of all time, but 3 is kind of a particularly high watermark. And even though there were ports of Metal Gear Solid 2 on other systems, Metal Gear Solid 3 was an exclusive. And the re-release here, Subsistence, had online play that wasn't bad all the way back in 2005. But yet again, huge leaps over prior generations and very identifiable as PlayStation 2 games. You had a whole genre kind of start and get kind of up to speed with like third-person action games, high-speed action games. Like you had the first Devil May Cry trilogy, 1, 2, and 3. The high point being right here in my hands, Devil May Cry 3, which would, later influence tons and tons of action games like God of War and what have you. Of course, with God of War, you had God of War 1 and 2, you had Shinobi 1 and 2, you had Nightshade. And that's something you're going to see kind of a trend of with this console generation, particularly this console. Is like you did not get one or two games in a series. You would get maybe 2 to 4, and they were games kind of hit a certain balance at this point where budget and production would allow for multiple quality releases in a series to happen within one console generation, which is something you see less and less of these days. There's longer and longer gaps between sequels. While that's not necessarily a bad thing, you'd have entire series on this generation of consoles. Like I said, Devil May Cry 1, 2, and 3, Silent Hill 2, 3, and 4. Some titles I don't have displayed here, like Jak and Daxter 1, 2, and 3, and Sly Cooper 1, 2, and 3, and Ratchet and Clank 1, 2, and 3. So many, like that was just possible, and that there was not a dip in quality between those. It just games weren't so advanced that they took forever to make, but they were still able to come out at a reasonable pace and keep that momentum going. Of course, you had high watermarks in storytelling in games and scope of games with an early release like Final Fantasy X. What can I say about this game? This game was kind of made JRPGs or continued the trend that kind of started with 7, but kind of continued it with this generation of making JRPGs high art games in a lot of ways, like the top tier of games, which is a strange thought. But during this era, like JRPGs were these beautiful, high budget, long, lengthy, epic adventures that people expected a lot from. And, with games like Final Fantasy X and, titles we'll talk about later, but like Shadow Hearts being another early title, it was easy to see why. Square Enix killing it that generated with action RPGs of similar scope, like the Kingdom Hearts series. Yet again, you got Kingdom Hearts 1, 2, and Rechain of Memories all in one console generation. Can you imagine that? These were not short games. These were huge, influential games. Beautiful, fun combat, with an unreal crossover. Like Kingdom Hearts is massive, and to this day, this series continues as highly venerated. You had the real breakout hits for the Shin Megami series in the US with games like Nocturne starting to really become popular. Yet again, being these huge, epic, but difficult and more adult-oriented games. These games still coming out to this day with Shin Megami 5 recently coming out on the Nintendo Switch. And that'll lead us into another game, Shin Megami series in a little bit. But not just these massive titles. You had from bigger companies like Shin Megami, Final Fantasy, well-established RPGs that had begun before. You also had newer franchises like Xenosaga. Yes, taking inspiration from prior Xenogears, but this was its own trilogy on the PS2. Huge, massive cinematic RPGs that are still beloved to this day. People screaming for a remaster to this day. Recently got word that it's not going to happen, unfortunately. Very identifiable as a PlayStation 2 game. The Dot Hack series, 7 of them. The first 4 quadrilogy and the second trilogy, all coming out on the PS2. The second trilogy, the GU games, recently getting a port on the Switch and a few years ago on the PlayStation 4. Wonderful, smaller budget RPGs that were still fantastic and ambitious, spread across multiple games that would carry your save data, which, yet again, novel at the time, but like not something that you would see very often. And to this day, I wish more sequels would kind of do this and carry your data over. And man, going into the latter half of the PlayStation 2, those last couple of years gave us some of the greatest games of all time, like almost at a monthly rate. Shadow of the Colossus, often considered like kind of PlayStation's high art game, the answer like to what's like one of the most emotional games and stories, minimalism. It's one of the most striking games of all time. Getting remastered on the PS3 and remade on the PS4 in wonderful fashion. Shadow of the Colossus, what could I say? More niche titles that were just fun and experimental, like God Hand. Never been really ported to anything else. You could download it on PS3, but Capcom and Clover Studio just going for it with something fantastic. And speaking of Clover, one of the greatest games of all time, yet again, Okami releasing not too far away from these others in 2005. What can I say? Yet again, the answer to Zelda, essentially. You took a bunch of people that helped to make some of the handheld Zeldas, like Minish Cap from Capcom. They came back and they're like, we're going to make our own kind of homage to Zelda. And in my opinion, it's better than any Zelda game of that era. And generally, this game is considered one of the best of all time. It's been re-released on everything from, the Wii, the PS3, the PS4, the Xbox One, the Switch. Okami keeps getting re-released because it is that good and deserves to be played by everyone. Yet again, a huge 40-hour adventure, something that was kind of a risk if it was to be made today, like this massive budget artsy game, where you play as a wolf and everything's kind of very Japanese and cartoony. Just something that I don't know if you would really see come out with this amount of budget today. You would have the beginnings of the Yakuza series with Yakuza 1 and 2, which is still huge to this day. It took a few years to get started, but Yakuza is now like Sega's biggest franchise up there with Sonic. There's like a yearly release of Yakuza, and these games were fantastic. They were kind of written off as like, at first sight, as like GTA clones, but they're not. They were full-fledged, like kind of RPGs with beat 'em up mechanics set in the modern day. Wonderful games that, yet again, I'm glad is finally getting the attention it deserves now, but it started in this era and is still continuing to this day, with Yakuza 1 and 2 being remade not long ago. And of course, in the very late days of the PS2, 2008, you get games like Persona 4, Persona 3 were launching in 2006. Yet again, Persona 3 getting remade early next year. Persona 4 recently getting re-released on every major platform, the Persona 4 Golden. These people love these games oh so much. This game would spin off multiple fighting games and a rhythm game. And remember, this was in the dying days of the PS2. This game in particular came out 2 years after the PS3 launched. This 100-hour JRPG about high school shenanigans and also like inner demons that you physically fight. With this era, it kind of became that beloved franchise, and it's still running from that today. It's still like carrying that momentum today with games like Persona 5 taking over the world. And that's not to say there were smaller niche titles that were just great and sprinkled throughout the PS2 lifespan, that like Zone of the Enders 1 and 2. Zone of the Enders 2 recently getting released on the PS4 a few years back. Another, people say, oh, Kojima, only Metal Gear. No, he also produced this title, had a lot of input on it. It's like a kind of a stalwart of the PS2, and it's been re-released a few times. You had games like Katamari Damacy and We Love Katamari premiering on the PS2. These games are still getting re-released and made to this day. This weirdness, this experimental era, birthed other great games like Mr. Mosquito. Fun little game where you play as a mosquito feeding on a Japanese household during the summer and you don't want to get squashed. And what I'm trying to show here, I guess, after all that rambling, is like, look at this diversity on just one console, on a Sony console. Sony now has kind of become like the front runner in like cinematic and very westernized gaming kind of culture. Like games like The Last of Us and Horizon and Spider-Man are great. But like, look at these games that were exclusive for the most part to the PS2, where some were like, yes, big budget cinematic games, what you would call at the time, but the variety, you have beat 'em ups, you have action games, you have puzzle games, you have fighting games, what have you, spread out amongst all of this. And they each got like released, on one console generation. You get multiple games like Shadow of the Colossus Knight were actually produced by Sony. Like this number of titles, this is like, if this amount of titles would be like 4 generations worth of games now with the amount of time it would take them. Yes, of course the graphics would be better, but just to show, a lot of these games have planted the seeds for what's incredibly popular now. And that's only on the PlayStation 2 front. Just with it being the most prominent system during that generation, undoubtedly, outselling all the other consoles. Like, if you were to combine all the other consoles of that generation and triple it, it still barely hit what the PlayStation 2 sold. So obviously, with the PlayStation 2 being the most popular, I wanted to kind of focus on that. But it, of course, wasn't the only console in town. Of course, we had Nintendo's beloved GameCube. Now the Switch, it has taken over the world. I think it may be individually the greatest Nintendo system. I can make a whole nother video on that, but the GameCube was a wild time for Nintendo, right? Yes, they came in last place. The main race for these consoles was kind of between the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, because Dreamcast was kind of already out. And I guess you could say GameCube came in third with the lowest sales. But that's not to knock the quality of the GameCube, because people love GameCube games and are screaming for them to come back on the Switch. Why was the GameCube so great? Well, you had absolutely wonderful like first party titles, of course, like Super Mario Sunshine, being a weird and wacky title to follow Mario 64. Metroid Prime, which recently got re-released on the Switch. People still wanting Metroid Prime 4 and remasters of 2 and 3 oh so badly, because these games were wonderful. Yet again, you had Metroid Prime 1 and 2 release on the GameCube and be wonderful experiments. The first time Metroid was going first person, like what were they going to do? They knocked it out of the park. Of course, you have Super Smash Bros. Melee, the highest selling game on GameCube. Competitively, probably the most beloved Smash Brothers, only like rivaled in popularity by the most recent Ultimate 20 years later, kind of solidifying what Smash Brothers was after kind of the preamble that was the 64 version. People still screaming for this game to get some type of re-release. You have F-Zero GX, the last proper home release of F-Zero, one of the most difficult and fantastic racing games of all time. A collaboration between Nintendo and Sega. You don't hear that every day, even now. And yet again, there are games like Fast Racing RMX, but like people want this game in particular. And we recently got F-Zero 99 on the Switch, but it's just not exactly what people wanted. They're screaming for it. Yet again, a challenging game. Nintendo did an odd thing during this era where they kind of wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to have an incredibly powerful console and have it fully featured with a ton of great games. Now, while it wasn't as powerful as the Microsoft Xbox, which we'll talk about later, it was more powerful than the PS2, and it really showed with a lot of beautiful games. But despite that, it didn't just rely on its power. They relied on creativity and originality with great games like Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door, another beloved game that's getting a re-release that people have been screaming for years from this era to come back. They've done Paper Mario sequels after this, but none have really held a candle to this game's quality, and I'm really glad to be seeing it come back. And of course, most people say, oh, Nintendo, it was viewed for a very long time as kind of the kiddie system or a system that was more aimed at children or families. GameCube was really one of the first ones to kind of start breaking out of that, really show people that Nintendo was willing to work with third parties and more adult-oriented games and bring them out on their consoles. Like the exclusive Resident Evil 1 remake, one of the most beautiful games of all time, one of the greatest survival horror games of all time for years, was originally a GameCube exclusive. This was a game that made people really take note of the GameCube that maybe didn't necessarily love Nintendo titles. This game looked unbelievable, still really does, played fantastically. It's considered one of the greatest Resident Evil of all time. And this is not a family-friendly game. This was strictly a GameCube title for the longest of times. And they re-released a number of Resident Evil games on the GameCube, including 2 and 3 and Code Veronica. They had another exclusive game with Resident Evil 0, though not quite as good, still a fantastic looking game. And of course, how can we talk about the 6th generation of consoles without talking about GameCube exclusive Resident Evil 4? Now, this game may be a joke in circles, at least its exclusivity. This was only exclusive to the GameCube for like under a year before it came to the PS2. But yet again, this was a game that you wouldn't normally associate with Nintendo. And when it came out, it was experimental with its behind-the-shoulder cam. It was not the first one to really do that. There were earlier titles like Kill Switch and what have you, but it was the first game of notoriety to do it. And this kind of changed how shooters would kind of be in the long run. The games like Gears of War would take influence from this. And this game is considered one of the greatest of all time. And recently in 2023, just got a re-release. And that game was considered one of the best games of this year. And it all started in this generation on the little purple GameCube. This system was really cooking. Speaking of remakes, there's also other fantastic GameCube exclusive titles like Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. Fantastic remake of a game that had only come out a few years before, but what an upgrade. Metal Gear Solid on the PS1 is one of the greatest games of all time. They decided to take the graphics and physics engine from Metal Gear Solid 2 and cram it into Metal Gear Solid 1. Now, not everyone's happy with some of the cutscene directions in this. I think that's a silly reason not to like a game. This is a fantastic re-release. To this day, is still only found on the Nintendo GameCube. And is highly vaunted for it now, but just showing like the GameCube had some variety. And Nintendo was willing to do like some fantastic new IPs of their own in that adult sphere, like Eternal Darkness, another game that people are screaming for a re-release for. And it's not something you see too much today. You don't see too many brand new Nintendo M-rated horror IPs. I wish they would do more. I mean, Luigi's Mansion is great, but it's not exactly the same thing. Yet again, man, the variety here. You had first-party like titles of high quality. You had new IPs coming out of high quality, ports, third-party games, what have you. All really great on that GameCube. Legend of Zelda Wind Waker being one of the most beloved Zeldas. After initially having a bit of a rough start in the public eye, people ended up loving that console. And that brings me to the console that somehow miraculously broke into the scene in 2001 up against the big boys of Nintendo and Sony, and actually held its ground and ended up outselling the GameCube. You guys know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Microsoft Xbox coming out in November 2001. And I've said this before, but I want to reiterate how incredible that was. Just because Microsoft was a big company did not guarantee that it was going to have a successful console launch. I mean, you can look at modern things today, like it's more of a digital platforms, but things like Stadia or Luna, not exactly taking the world over. And there was, of course, failures from prior generations from large companies. Gaming companies like Sega and Atari were forced to drop out. You had companies try to bring things in like the Philips CDI, another big company that failed. What have you, the Atari Jaguar failed right out of the box. So just because Microsoft had that money did not necessarily mean that it was going to make a good gaming console, but they did, and they've stuck around for over 20 years. They were the last ones to kind of enter this sphere. I mean, you have consoles like the 3DO, which was incredibly powerful and highly funded by a number of, high financial backers. Didn't last, didn't stick, didn't make any impact. Somehow Xbox did because they made all the right moves, especially here in North America. Of course, when you talk about the original Xbox, you have to talk about the success of Halo. Now, maybe in today's sphere, Halo is dead, unfortunately. I think with Infinite, it kind of missed its last chance to become truly great again. However, I need any associations with Halo being like a bro shooter or a Call of Duty shooter to kind of go away. This was more akin to what like PCs were doing at the time, kind of like this wonderful space opera with large open alien environments, very, very smart enemy AI, beautiful vistas, vehicle combat. Halo, of course, was the tip of the spear for the Xbox, and it really showed what it could do very early in its lifespan. But it wasn't the only title that carried this wonderful system. Just to say, it was the most powerful system by a very wide margin of this era, much more powerful than the contemporaries of PS2 and the GameCube. And while there were ports between all three of them, which I think was great, if a game was ported to all three systems, is usually pretty comparable, but the Xbox version came out on top generally in terms of fidelity or what have you. However, some games really showed how much more powerful it was. Games like Ninja Gaiden or Dead or Alive 3, fantastic early exclusive for Dead or Alive 3, showing the power and kind of the variety of gameplay. Ninja Gaiden showing kind of the Xbox's answer to Devil May Cry, but in many ways blew it away in terms of fidelity and difficulty. And it was a great way to show off the console's power, and was a highly kind of advertised exclusive. But there were a number of smaller exclusives. To this day, people are like screaming to get some type of re-release, and this pair of games I've talked about many times was thankfully added to the Xbox Series X backwards compatibility list. Games like Otogi, Japanese games from Software, the Dark Souls makers, making a pair of fantastic action games that have never been ported anywhere. And this is something you don't see today anymore. You don't see Japanese support of the Xbox, and I think that's a big part of why it's really struggling behind the PlayStation and the Switch. It's due to the lack of variety of titles. Just to show some more, you had like games from Sega exclusives like Gun Valkyrie and the Panzer Dragoon Orta, the fourth Panzer Dragoon game. Like, these were great titles that you couldn't find anywhere else. Unique games. Jet Set Radio Future, yet again, people are still like emulating this game's style, even better than Jet Grind Radio, an Xbox exclusive to this day. You would never see something like this. I mean, We did have Hi-Fi Rush earlier in the year on the Xbox, but yet again, it was more common back then. You had games from Namco like Breakdown, weird, experimental, beautiful exclusives, first-person action game, also just recently added a backwards compatibility, not found anywhere else. The Xbox was so powerful it could play PC games at a pretty good level back then. The other consoles couldn't really do, and they were basically exclusives. And that would be like games like Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic. Can also say that the original Xbox was like a Star Wars machine. There are some good Star Wars titles now with like the Fallen Order games, but there were like a dozen on just the original Xbox, and they were the best versions of these games in a lot of cases. You had games like Jedi Starfighter, Starfighter Special Edition, Republic Commando, Battlefront 1, Battlefront 2, Obi-Wan, Old Republic 1 and 2, the Clone Wars, Episode 3. There were so many Star Wars games back then. It's kind of odd now that we only get one every other couple of years, but most of the ones, particularly Knights of the Old Republic and Republic Commando, were fantastic on the original Xbox. And of course, you had the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind being a console exclusive back then, the game that would kind of set the template for Bethesda's success going forward with Oblivion and Skyrim and Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas and 4. And while Bethesda is definitely on the low right now, this game is still my favorite Bethesda. This might be my favorite Western RPG. While there were a lot of quality of life and graphical updates with Oblivion and Skyrim, it lost some of the personality and minute like kind of eccentricities of Morrowind. And I think that's something that company could really use right now, because I think they got a little too big for their britches, right? They kind of forgot where they kind of came from. I think this game still holds up as one of the greatest RPGs of all time, and it was only on the Xbox on consoles back then, right? And like, my God, there were experimental titles that you just wouldn't get today. You get games like Steel Battalion with its massive $250 controller by Capcom of all people. Yet again, these were kind of gambles, but it was able to be made back then. And yeah, guys, like that just shows you like the original Xbox, of course, having things, feature-wise, we're focusing more on the games, but online play, of course, being available in a very minute form on GameCube, a slightly better form on PS2, but what we would call in the modern day online play really kind of began on the original Xbox, with games like Halo 2 and Mech Assault and Crimson Skies being fantastic examples. That console was wonderful. And that brings me to kind of like, there were games, there were just kind of like styles of games you don't get as much anymore, and if you do, they're digital only. Mid-level games, not quite indie, but not quite AAA, like weird things like Dark Watch and Blood Rain being re-released thankfully not too long ago. These were like good budgeted games that you couldn't call indie, like this mid-level game. I'm so glad that the game Evil West recently came out, but yet again, it was kind of under the radar. Like it's more of a rarity these days. You had fantastic games that would show up on multiple consoles, right? You would have games like The Warriors and Max Payne and Grand Theft Auto showing up on PS2, Xbox, sometimes GameCube. And do you know what these are? These are Rockstar games. Everyone's getting really hyped up over Grand Theft Auto 6 coming out, but it's been like a decade since Grand Theft Auto 5, and I think Red Dead 2 came out in 2018. Rockstar used to make like a game a year on back in this era, and they were fantastic and they were huge, and sometimes they were just really good story-driven games like Max Payne 1 and 2. You had Manhunt, you had Grand Theft Auto 3, Vice City, San Andreas, and later on Liberty City Stories and Vice City Stories being ported over from the PSP. Like, there was a balance between these games and their development. You would just get like a number of them, right? You would have a myriad of genres coming out, and like right now, it's pretty much one game per franchise per console, and you kind of have to wait a while. You had epic games of genre games at the time, like Capcom versus SNK 2. You had the Fatal Frame series coming out. Also, just to note, a lot of these games were more enhanced on the original Xbox with extra features. Today, when this happens, there's like an outcry, like when Spider-Man was exclusive to the PlayStation version of Avengers. Like, it's a huge like negative now, but people were kind of like excited about it back then. You had like the Onimusha series. You got an enhanced port only on the original Xbox. You wouldn't see that today, really. yet again, there was just like more risk taking because more games could be made quickly, but not at the detriment of their quality. You had series like Guilty Gear coming out, on multiple consoles being fantastic, starting, and Guilty Gear to this day is still kind of rocking. And man, I can kind of ramble on forever. Weird games that would be buried under Steam pages now, or PlayStation pages, or the Switch stores pages, like Tulip, what have you. And that kind of just brings me, wow, I've really rambled on. I've gotten very excited about this. It kind of brings me to the conclusion of why I think this is the greatest generation, why I think the preceding generations didn't necessarily surpass it. Now, while I said I don't think any gaming generation is bad, I think an argument can be made for any gaming generation. The preceding generation, the seventh generation, the Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii era, we're still kind of like in that era in a lot of ways. There hasn't been a huge shift since then. While online gaming started to get big in the console space with the original Xbox, to a lesser extent the PS2 and what have you, the online infrastructure that we're familiar with today, DLC practices, online shops, that really began in the generation following this. And with that came some unfortunate truths. While fantastic, while this console generation did not have online shops like the preceding generations, there was a minor one on the original Xbox. I didn't really want to incorporate that into my thought process of best console generation. It's like, all right, a ton of these games have been re-released on future consoles, but yet again, can you say that those count for the Switch? Like, you can download Metroid Prime Remastered on Switch. Does that count to the Switch's strengths as well? In a broader sense, yes, but it's still leaning on the strength of a prior generation when it comes to that game. So I kind of took that out of this equation. But with online being more evident, some unfortunate practices came in. DLC seemed like a cool thing in the very beginning. You can expand your game, but it kind of started to lead to developers as early as in the 360 and PS3 era, kind of releasing games somewhat unfinished, right? You have an example like a game I love, Azura's Wrath. You need to buy that game's ending. You have the problem with patches. Like, yes, not every game released in a perfect state back then. If a glitch was in a game back in the state, essentially it was going to stay in there. They might have to reissue the game physically in rare instances. But I think maybe there was more of an onus on getting a finished product to you, the end user. While a game could started to be able to launch in a buggy state, and they would just patch it later. With the advent of HD as well, Japan very much struggled in a lot of their development. It's well documented that that's kind of when the West started to kind of take over in the gaming space. Like, Japan was kind of the gaming company, like Xbox, even the Microsoft Xbox being made here had a huge amount of Japanese support back in these days. But during the 360 PS3 era, that's kind of when you would see more of the rise of Activision, EA, Ubisoft, Western-based developers, and some of the not so savory practices that you get from games series like Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed and what have you. And going back, that era struggled with its HD, much how like 3D in the PS1, Saturn, and N64 era was early. HD gaming in its first generation with the 360 and PS3 struggled. So a lot of those games did not run fantastically compared to, let's say, the PS2, which most games ran at 60 frames per second very consistently. And while I'm not the person that necessarily cares about things like that, it is somewhat noticeable. And artistically, a lot of games became more militaristic looking, grays, browns, dark greens, games that looked like Gears of War, let's say. That kind of look was prevalent during that generation. And not to say that generation isn't fantastic on its own. There's hundreds of great games on the PS3 and 360. And the Wii was kind of odd. The Wii was obviously an odd duck where it didn't focus on online and a lot of those practices, and it has a huge amount of fantastic titles. But compared to the GameCube, that's a very tough one. While I have a lot of appreciation for the Wii with games like Mario Galaxy and No More Heroes and Mad World and what have you, I don't think that, I think some franchises kind of disappeared. Some of that weird uniqueness started to disappear from that. You didn't exactly have like Wario Land or a new F-Zero or new Luigi's Mansion in that time. So while the Wii was fantastic, I don't know if its legacy is quite overcoming the GameCube in its time. So that while I think the seventh generation is great, I started to see that those practices that I mentioned earlier kind of came in because that's when gaming kind of stopped being niche, right? I mean, sure, the PS2 is the highest selling game console of all time, but you guys know what I'm talking about. That's when, you got the bro gamers with Call of Duty coming out every year, and you got your grandma, getting the Wii or the DS to play Brain Age. Like gaming kind of opened the floodgates, and not to say that gatekeeping is necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing either, because now publishers saw that opportunity for money, and with the West kind of leading the charge, started to kind of, everyone knows this, have predatory practices. And I think that that generation lasted forever. The 360, PS3, Wii era, that generation was like way too long before the next one came along. And I think that bubble burst a little bit as the casual market kind of moved on to phones and things like that. So like obviously the Wii U was a massive failure sales wise. I like that console a lot, but that was a tough recovery for Nintendo. The Xbox One lacked an identity with its near drop of Japanese developers in a lot of ways. It was never able to kind of recover from its initial launch. That was very casual focused. Like it was more of an entertainment center. The whole thing with Don Metric, that was a terrible launch. The PS4, on the other hand, I will say I think was better than the PS3 in a lot of ways. There was more goodwill. You saw a lot of individuality come back with games like Last Guardian and Gravity Rush. And you would get some great titles like Spider-Man and a multitude of Final Fantasies. However, while I think Sony did really well in that generation, they started to kind of show some unsettling threads of kind of winding down their more unique games. Like you're not going to get a Patapon or a Loco Roco as much anymore, or a Parappa the Rappa. And that generation is kind of bleeding into the one we have right now, which we can talk about in a different video. But the reason why this sixth generation was kind of like that tipping point, and I feel like a lot of gamers are yearning for this era of game war, where they were not these huge live service games that would go on forever, or like games that needed tons of DLCs and updates and what have you. They were just like these little pieces of really fun artwork, if you will. And I think that shows in what's popular and growing in popularity now. The Yakuza series, like I said, the Persona series, as I said, like had their seeds planted here, and they're doing fantastically. Grand Theft Auto was not as popular as it was before Part 3, and while I think Rockstar has lost their way with the satire of the series, it got its start here. Elder Scrolls, Bethesda in general, really hit it big with Morrowind. And to see what they've kind of done to themselves over the years, where they kind of lost their uniqueness. Morrowind was a unique game. I think people are yearning for them to kind of get that character back. Resident Evil, of course, after a lull between Resident Evil 3 and 4, there was a lot of years between those two games, exploded in popularity. And those games are still beloved to this day. So many of these games to this, like people are yearning for continuations, for remakes of games like Metal Gear Solid 3 and Silent Hill. People yearn for the days of when Halo was fantastic, which started here. It's almost sad in a way that these games were so good, and maybe a lot of them weren't recognized in their time. But I really do think that this generation was the culmination of everything that came before, and nothing was lost up until that point. Like this generation maintained all the character of the generations before it, and after this, things started to kind of fall off in some ways. I think gaming is still great to this day. However, I can honestly say when I look over these titles, I am both happy and nostalgic because of their sheer quality. These are some of the greatest games of all time. Yeah, guys, I think that's almost undebatable, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what 2024 will bring us. I really hope that all the consoles start kicking ass. I mean, the PS5 is doing well. The Series Xbox is unfortunately lagging behind pretty badly. It lacks the character of this generation, and the Switch is doing fantastic. which is a miracle considering how bad the Wii U did. Like, what a turnaround. And the number one things people want from it are GameCube games, right? They want, or sequels to GameCube games. They want an F-Zero. They want Metroid Prime Remastered 2 and 3 and 4. We're getting, we got Luigi's Mansion 3, the sequel to a game series that started on the GameCube. We want the re-release of Wind Waker, what have you. Even in third-party titles like Marvel vs. Capcom 2, people want that. People want Sonic Adventure 3. People want like Marvel vs. Capcom 2 re-release. Let me restate. Garo, Mark of the Wolves is getting a sequel soon too. Like, these were all games that were popularized in this generation, and what a generation it is. And guys, I can ramble on all night, but I think I'm going to wrap it up there. And I want to know, what did you think of this talk? Did you have fun hearing about this? Do you disagree with me? Why do you disagree with me? Because I know I'm going to have some people out there fighting me on this one. What do you think is wrong with this generation? What do you think is the greatest gaming generation of all time? What do you think modern gaming could learn from this generation? Because I think it's a lot. So yeah, with that said, guys, I'm going to wrap it up because I got to go play some of these games. So yet again, if you've liked this video, if you like content like this, please let me know below. Please like and subscribe and do all that YouTube stuff. I've had a ton of fun doing this. My name is Mike. This has been Chip Damage, and please take care of yourself.